Was the Revelation 12 verses 1 to 5 sign fulfilled on September 23rd, as so many have been hoping? We'll take that question into the Forge. Hi, everyone. I'm Ron Matsen. If you've been following the Forge, you know that we've had a couple of sessions here where we've looked at the questions associated with some of the interpretations of the Revelation chapter 12, verses 1 to 5 sign. And we've addressed them here. And what I want to do today is now, since this is the 23rd of September 2017, we want to take a look at those, and I'm going to invite someone onto the program, I think, that will give us some great insight. Now, just as a recap, perhaps you've not heard of this, or you're wondering what I'm going to be addressing. There's a conclusion that was come to by many, that September 23rd, 2017 is the date of the fulfillment of the Revelation 12 prophecy concerning both the woman and the child. The expectation of that date was perhaps it was even heralding the rapture of the church. Now, the evidence that most of them pointed to was based on a convergence that involves the constellation Virgo. It happens, the 23rd, the 21st happens on or about the Feast of Trumpets. It's a time when the sun passes through Virgo, Virgo being a symbol of the nation of Israel. The moon passes by the feet of Virgo. Jupiter enters and remains in Virgo as the child that's depicted there in the vision in Revelation 12. And the 12 crowns, or the 12 stars are made up of the 9 stars of Leo, plus Mercury, Venus, and Mars provide the other 3 stars, the 12 stars. And so this is the evidence that they all point to, all converging on this day, the 23rd of September 2017. Now, the assumptions that are made here is what I really want to look at in this post-analysis, really. Number one is this is based on the Genesis 1:14 word signs, which they believe is equivalent to the Mazzaroth. It's presented by some as the gospel in the stars. Number two, Job 38, verses 31 and 32, where there is this use of the word Mazzaroth, and it's believed to be equated to the 12 constellations of what we now know as the zodiac. We then have the Matthew chapter 2 star that's referenced there, often referred to as the Bethlehem star, and that this was, at the time of the birth of Christ, was again another Virgo convergence of a sort. We'll take a look at that in terms of what the text tells us. And Revelation 12 itself, whether or not the child that's depicted there is the church. Now, what I'm going to do is we're going to look at that first, and the way we're going to do it is I've invited onto the program Dr. William Welty. And so William will be joining us from his residence in California. Welcome to the program, William.
Hello. Well, welcome to the end of the world.
Well, that's certainly how some depicted it, and many people may not know who you are. So give us a little bit of background in terms of who you are and your association and with Bible interpretation. So give us a little background, William.
With respect to my educational background, I hold a Master Divinity degree. Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield, Illinois. I studied New Testament Greek and Biblical Hebrew under some of the foremost evangelical scholars of their generation, Walter Kaiser and Gleason Archer. And when I left seminary, I taught Greek for 10 years in a Christian law school, and developed some technology issues that allowed me to sell the technology, start a foundation to produce a new Bible translation called the Standard Version. And I supervised the production of arguably what has been considered the most readable and accurate modern language translation of the Bible ever produced. And that gives me some training and background, and frankly some bona fides to speak reliably about the meaning of the text, both in Hebrew language when they're trying to study it, and particularly with respect to issues relating to the book of Revelation and this heresy, this new heresy that's been infecting the church for the last couple of years, that I think you and I have come to label as astro-eschatology. That is a unbiblical and frankly occultic amalgamation of Babylon mystery, cult issues relating to astrology, and the book of Revelation, particularly the apocalyptic literature, prophetic literature that discusses the end of days. So that's basically where I come from. People who are familiar with K-House know that I have been served for many years as a board member and have been a regular teacher at the Koinonia House Strategic Perspective Conference, which I expect to address next month. And it's particularly interesting that we would choose this hour and this time to do this study of a refutation of the astro-eschatology heresy, because literally at 2 o'clock California time on the 23rd, which is what on the 22nd, it is midnight, literally, in Jerusalem, the beginning of the Feast of Trumpets, which means the end of the world will be sometime in the next 24 hours, if you believe the nonsense that's been floating around the internet. And of course, we deny that completely. I will tell you, Ron, I believe that there's a good high possibility that we're seeing the fulfillment of Matthew 24:11, if you want to talk about Bible prophecy, on the second coming, where Jesus talked about a falling away from the faith that will come about in the end times. And he says many, the Greek word poloi means this is not going to be a minor movement. A lot of people will be scandalized. That is the Greek word. They would fall away because of the scandal of disappointments. I believe it's because of people like this. They twist the scriptures using an occultic amalgamation, and they sell a whole lot of books until, of course, the day after.
Yes.
Which will be, by the time this is aired, in the past.
Yes, yes. Well, let me just, when you were giving us sort of your quick overview of your experience, your audio cut out, I think, and I'm not sure that they understood that you are actually the founder and president of the International Standard Version Bible Foundation, which is this new English translation, which is being released and has been available in part through the internet. And so you've been involved with the translation both of the Hebrew and the Greek, and also have dealt with scholars in Hebrew and Greek as you've been compiling this new English translation. Is that correct?
Yes, I translated personally a third of the Old Testament for the ISV, creating the base translation, which was edited by our team of scholars. And I was involved in the polishing of the look and feel of the entire text. So I think I could say with some frankness that I'm considered to be an expert in this subject.
Okay.
And I will tell you for the record, this eschatology heresy is one of the most dangerous that I've seen in the last few years. It even eclipses, if you'll pardon the pun, the nonsense floating around passed by Mark Biltz and others like him about the blood moon controversy, which I went on record before it happened saying it will mean nothing. It has nothing to do with the end of days or anything like that. It's sort of like people who say, you know, we're getting all these hurricanes. We must be at the end of days. The answer is, show me one verse in the Bible that talks about hurricanes heralding the end of days. It talks about earthquakes. It does that in plagues. But hurricanes, no. Natural disasters. We don't want to read into the text of history what we think we want it to say. My assessment of these people is that they have forsaken the grammatical, historical method of interpretation of Scripture. They hate or avoid systematic biblical studies and systematic theology. Toward that end, they mirror the emergent church heresy. And when you forsake the grammatical, historical method of what does the text say, what does the language mean, what would an average guy understand it when he read it, how would they understand it? If you forsake that, it can mean anything you want, and you just read into the text anything that your wicked imagination decides to produce.
Right.
And that's what we have in this heresy.
Yep. Right. So, William, what I want to do is, given your experience, your capability with languages, I want to take a look at these 4 passages that I presented at the beginning of the program. We're going to start with Genesis chapter 1, verses 14 and 15. I think it's good to keep the whole thought together there. And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. And God set them in the firmament of heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the 4th day. And so we have the total summary there of this day 4 creation. But what we want to look at is there are 5 objectives that are mentioned there of these bodies in the firmament above. Number 1, they're there to give light upon the earth. They're there to be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. And so the question here really is, what does the term, because this is what's been focused on by the people who are promoting the idea of the constellations being a way in which we can unlock biblical prophecy. What's the meaning of this, and let them be for signs? A lot of people focus on that. You've mentioned a few of them, but in particular, in the passage itself, what does the Hebrew tell us?
Well, let's unfold it. First of all, we need to correct a presupposition question. Hebrew is very action-oriented. Therefore, the thing to do when you're coming across a passage that you want to look at is you want to take a look at the verbs first, then the nouns.
Right.
The key verb here is in the Hebrew, the ISV reads, "Let there be lights across the sky to distinguish day from night." The actual Hebrew word means to govern. The question is, what is being governed? The answer is given in the next words. The objects is the verb. To govern day from night, and then it tells you what they're referring to. To act as signs for seasons, days, and years. To serve as lights in the sky, to shine on the earth. Going backwards, to shine on the earth, God uses the sun to create light and life on the earth. To serve as lights in the sky, that would be primarily for navigation. God expected the world to be settled after Eden. And so the stars were given to navigate oceans by. Then to act as for signs, seasons. The key for that is the verb to govern. What it means is it's a reference to the liturgical calendar of ancient Israel. In other words, they're talking about the feasts of Yom Kippur, for instance, the Day of Atonement. We're talking about Passover. We're talking about the Feast of Trumpets, yes, and other days like that. God put the stars in place, it says, to govern them. That is, to let us know, to administer when to hold those feasts, seasons and days and years. Because what he's telling us when we read the passage is that God created the cycles of the planets and the Earth going around the sun and all of those things on a regular schedule so that you could plan your calendar. So God uses the lights to govern our calendar. That is, that's how we determine when to hold the feast days. And they're so reliable that the Jews can calculate them forward in the future and back in the past with mathematical precision. So for anybody to say anything other than what I just said is going to read into the text what God never intended it to be there. This has to do with the atonement calendar. What's interesting about that is, if you look very carefully, verse 14 takes the fourth day. God did not create man until the sixth day, which means he foresaw the fall and the need for the atonement and put in place the calendar system to make that happen before he created man on the earth. That ought to tell us something about how far-sighted God is. He doesn't need astrology. We can get to that when we talk about Job and the references about binding the influence of the Pleiades.
All right. Well, let's move on to that then. So we've dealt with the idea, at least in a summary fashion, as to the understanding of the passage where someone would take this word signs to mean astrological sign in the heavens, and we've dismissed that in the sense that that's not what they're there for. They're there not to be prophetic signs, but rather signs for seasons associated with the Feast of Israel. So now let's move on to Job chapter 38, which is fascinating in what it doesn't tell us, but let me just read it. Verses 31 and 32. Canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Canst thou bring forth Maseroth in his season, or canst thou guide Arcturus with his sons? And so there we have it. The question here is, does the Hebrew word Maseroth mean the 12 constellations? Many Bible commentaries, when they look to that word, will have a footnote that flies out that says constellations plural or even constellations singular. And then a question along with that is there any relationship with a similar word used in 2 Kings chapter 23, verses 3 to 5, where that word Mazalot means the planets. It's translated there, the planets. And so there's some possible linkage there. But nonetheless, I'll leave the language expert to take a look at that. What's your thoughts with regard? This is a pivotal issue on the single use of this one Hebrew word. So much has been put on that with regards to this being a description of a Hebrew version of what might be a predecessor to the Babylonian zodiac. So let's unpack the text first.
Okay, first of all, let us, if we're not proud to seek it there, take an analogy from the video recording industry. Remember those old VHS players? When you plug them in, they flash the clock that says 12:00, and it keeps flashing all day long until you reset it?
Yes.
That digital clock is only right once a day at 12 o'clock.
Right.
The rest of the time it's wrong. Okay. That's the same way when you're dealing with these guys. The Hebrew word Maserot, it's a plural noun. It is meaning of constellation. They are correct. But that's the broken clock right once a day. They get the vocabulary correct. It's the application that's wrong. The best way to understand it is to let's take another look at Job 38, shall we? First of all, I'm going to read it in the ISV. It's a little bit more modern. Secondly, as we read it, let's unpack it, but put on our rabbi's thinking hat. Think like a rabbi. Read that verse. Can you bind the chains of Pleiades or loosen the cords of Orion? What would a rabbi say? The answer is a rabbi would say, God is saying, of course you cannot. Can you bring out the constellations in their season? No. Can you guide the bear with her cubs? No. But look at the next verse. It's the one they always forget. Do you know the laws of the heavens? Can you regulate their authority over the earth? The answer to those questions is also no. In other words, what God is saying to Job is, Job, neither you nor anyone else who's ever been born can ever systematize, regulate, or otherwise organize how God runs the universe. By definition, those verses in Job 38 are forbidding the use of astrology, including the zodiac. It's there in the rhetorical questions when God says, of course you don't know the laws. I do, but you don't, and you never will. You know why? Because it's none of our business. Under the Hebrew system in the Old Testament, the use of divination to predict the future was a capital offense. That's how seriously God took it. If you practice this stuff, you earn the death penalty. Now, as a practical consequence, just like you don't find anybody who commits adultery stoned to death in the Old Testament, so also God doesn't enforce it. He puts it on the books, and then when you practice that, what he does is like he did with David. He just abandons you to the consequences of your behavior. Your son dies, your kingdom is split away from your grandson, and your life is a misery for years. It's the same way with people who practice this astrology stuff. If they're not going to change, God will just abandon them and let them run down that bunny trail the rest of their life, and they become like the gold miner who has, to use the term of art, married the vein. He's looking for gold, and he's digging in the mine, and he keeps digging and digging and digging, and he swears that little piece of fleck of fool's gold is real stuff, and it isn't. So when you talk about Masaro, yes, the word means constellations. However, Greek words knew the difference between the constellations and real stars. For instance, the Hebrews did not really distinguish between them. They were not astronomers. They didn't really see the planets as anything other than wandering stars. In fact, that's the term of art used in the book of Jude for apostates, wandering stars for whom the blackness of space is used forever. A planet, literally in Greek, a planao, from the verb to wander, means from the earth it looks like they're moving all over the sky because of the retrograde motion as it goes around the sun. And yet in the New Testament, the term is never used to describe the appearance of God in giving directions to anybody, ever. In the book of Matthew, in chapter 2 of the Gospel, the reference to stars to the Shekinah glory of God has nothing to do with a conjunction of planets. There is a Greek word for constellation or conjunction. It's called asterion. It does not occur anywhere in the New Testament. The word used is aster. That word exists, and it means a general light. Lights in the skies, they could be wanderers as planets or the sun or the stars. It's all the same word. In the same way, the Hebrew word used to describe the light that guided the wise men moved inside the atmosphere of the earth. They were probably in Susa, over in the Babylonian area, and they would move north to come to Israel, along the Fertile Crescent, then west, and then south, down the King's Highway, and the star, so-called, led them not to Bethlehem at first, but to Jerusalem. And in fact, they already knew what the prophecies were, but Herod didn't. Herod had to ask where the Messiah was going to be born. The Magi already knew. And the Magi were not astrologers. They were godly Jews that were left behind during the Babylonian captivity. And the Bible talks about several of these guys. It talks about Nehemiah and Ezra and Daniel and Mordecai and even Esther. People who rose to power in the government of Babylon, who were entrusted with political insight. In fact, they would be the cultural equivalent today of the National Security Advisor to the king. And these Magi, they used to be astrologers. If you remember the story in Daniel chapter 2, a bunch of them got together and couldn't tell King Nebuchadnezzar what the facts were on the ground about his dream. So Nebuchadnezzar executed them all one night and they got to the last ones, which were Daniel and his friends, and they weren't astrologers, and so God gave them the opportunity to interpret the vision, and they took over. There weren't any astrologers left after Daniel and his three friends saved the day in Daniel chapter 2. So our view is that the Magi were not astrologers. They were not involved with a Maserat on any level whatsoever. Just because you find a bunch of synagogues dating from the 1st and 2nd century that have the Maserot in them, basically a Jewish take on astrology symbols named after the tribes of Israel, doesn't mean that that's what was originally designed for. It means that they syncretized Babylonian cult religion with biblical truth and became apostate along the way. And that's exactly what we're seeing today with this astro-eschatology movement.
Well, let me just backtrack a little bit here, because I think that you're on a tack that I want to investigate a little further, and that is this sense that is often promoted that in the beginning God created these constellations, and then the constellations are named or characterized after the names of the stars. The Bible does speak of God naming the stars, and somehow that naming of these specific stars and these specific constellations, one coming for each of the 12 months, would be what is referred to as the gospel and the stars. Now, what is fascinating to me is, although that is a very exciting idea, if it could be proved, the truth of the matter is the people who would have had better knowledge about those things than ourselves, the prophets of Israel, I find it fascinating two things. One is, none of them ever make reference to any constellation or convergence in any of their prophecies. In other words, if it was supposed to be such a stellar, excuse the pun, example of God's declaration of how prophecy will be revealed in the sky, it's strange that all of these prophets of the Old Testament, none of them utilized them nor made reference to them at all. In fact, the second fact is that when the use of stars, sun, and moon is addressed, it's addressed as pagan worship, which, as you've already pointed out, is something that God saw as worthy of capital punishment. And so it seems odd to me that there would be this now focus on something which clearly was not part of the Old Testament scenario, and we see no reference of it in any specific case to the New Testament. In other words, if the birth of Christ was associated with the convergence of something associated with the constellation Virgo and so on and so forth, because that does come into our third point, the Matthew 2 star, and you begin to really address that. We don't see that being a substance of the New Testament gospel. If there was such a demonstration in the heavens, surely someone would have made reference as a New Testament writer as it being evidence for the divine birth of the Son of God. And so when we deal with Matthew chapter 2, of course, there are lots of people. It's very popular to jump on the bandwagon with regards to what's referred to as Bethlehem star. And you and I have talked about this, but I want to expand that a little bit because the idea was that the Magi in Babylon were left with a legacy understanding of their the constellations, which when this constellation appeared in this particular fashion, the Magi's knew that that was associated with the King of the Jews, and they made their journey, and then they get to Jerusalem, and as you rightly point out, they somehow lost their way, and then the star, when they leave Jerusalem, the star reappears to them. The real question here is that star an astrological body, or is it something else? What are your thoughts?
A couple of thoughts on that. First of all, let's go back to your comment about the prophets never using astrology and not referencing to it. That's correct. Let's take an analogy, if you don't mind seeking it from there, from this little thing. See this?
Yes.
This is a little flashlight. See how bright it is?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Let's take this outside where the sun's shining and see if it's any good. Guess what? This is useless. You know why? Does one light a candle to see the sun? Why would a prophet who has a "thus saith the Lord" to guide him have to result to a bunch of stars in the sky? That's stupid. It is absolutely useless for determining the specific krema, literally specific statement that God has to say. The Bible uses two words to describe the Word of God in Greek: logos, the word, and the word phrema, which means a specific statement. A logos is a speech. Jesus is the Word of God. That is, He is what God has to say. Want to know what God's like? Look at Him. Want to know how to behave in a given situation? Look at how He responded. Go and do likewise. Want to know His on the subject? Read His Word, because that's the specific krema, the specific statements of given situations. It's in the same way with this. When you look at what the New Testament has to say about the star, there may have been a constellation or a conjunction of planets in 5 BC. By the way, these guys say it was in 2 BC, but it wasn't. According to the Los Angeles Observatory, that does a Christmas story thing every year with a heresy that says the Christmas Bethlehem star was a conjunction in 5 BC, not 2. They were wrong about that also. The mechanical truth is this had nothing to do with astronomy at all. Stars do not move in the atmosphere. This one did. It went ahead of them when they're going north along the Fertile Crescent, west along the Fertile Crescent, south along the Fertile Crescent, those hundreds of miles down to Jerusalem, and it stopped over Jerusalem. Didn't take it to Bethlehem, not at first. Oh, it did after they left Herod, but it disappeared for some reason. I think God was so angry at Herod, didn't want to say anything to him, that the Shekinah left them until they got out of his presence, and then he appeared again and guided them specifically to Bethlehem. So the Christian community has basically held that the Star of Bethlehem was the Shekinah glory of God that guided Israel during the night with fire and during the day with a cloud. That's what we're dealing with.
Right. I mean, it is interesting that it's referred to as we have in Matthew chapter 2, verse 2. It says, saying, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." The whole idea is that they saw something that was extraordinary. We also see in the New Testament the idea that one of the judgments will be that this idea of stars also representing angelic beings. We see that in the sense that the stars will be thrown to the earth and so on and so forth. These aren't the gaseous bodies that are creating light in the cosmos. And so the sense there is that by just simply making this a convenient convergence doesn't work as far as the text is concerned. And it also is peculiar in the sense that it seems to move around and led them not just to Bethlehem, but to a particular house in which the child was residing at that point. And that's pretty pinpoint accuracy. It's like following a rainbow.
You're talking about GPS coordinates, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean,
got it right down to the square foot where they were living.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, if you're driving along, which we here in New Zealand see a lot, you see a rainbow in the distance, and it can look very close to the ground, but the closer you get to it, of course, it's an illusion in the sense that it's going to keep moving. So it's never going to reside over that proverbial pot of gold, and stars don't reside over a house so they can identify the house. So
they are if it's the kind of glory of God, and there's a person in the cloud, that's for certain.
Right, because obviously the presence of God resided over the tabernacle in the wilderness, and it was one of the signs of the presence of God within the tabernacle. And so anyway, we'll leave that on. We'll come to now really the the Revelation 12 verses 1 and 2 passage. I want to read it just so that we can get a sense of the context of the 5 verses. And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, travailing in birth, and pain to be delivered. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew a third part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman which was to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. And she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And so the key elements here we've backed our way into based on these foundational interpretations that people have had with regards to this final point, which says regarding this woman, who is the woman, who is the child, and the fact that it's the reference here, it's one of the 13 references to the use of the word hapazo, and one of 4 references of someone being caught up into heaven. And so the question is, who is the child, and why is the child harpazoed into heaven? So we'll start with who is the woman with regards to the passage itself, William.
Well, first of all, one must keep in mind, dealing with apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature is God's graphical use. It's the way he takes a complex operating system, that is his plan for the ages, and he makes it understandable for Mac users like you and me.
Right.
So instead of giving you a complex set of commands and saying this is how I'm going to do it, and with all sorts of words, he does it with graphical user interfaces. Or like taking a novel and turning it into a comic book. An author might take 10 or 12 pages to paint a scene and with words that a comic book artist can do with a single panel. He doesn't have any of the detail, but he illustrates with a single picture the reality behind what he's trying to communicate. That's what apocalyptic literature is. It's designed to communicate basic imagery without giving details for 2 reasons. One, it's none of our business. God is not creating a cosmic TV guide to tell us what's going to be on TV next week. Secondly, he anticipates hostile jamming, so he encodes it so that you can't come out and fulfill it on your own time or by your own purposes, or to block him in his work and fulfill it for your own purposes. So when apocalyptic literature talks about this woman, the historic view of the church has been that it has a dual symbolism. That first of all, it refers to Israel as the nation. But then secondly, it has to the Son is a reference not to the church, but to Jesus. And how we know that is because it's described in verse 5. She gave birth to a son who is to rule the nations with an iron scepter. Well, who was that? It's not the church. The church is not raptured. The woman is going to give birth to a son. The son is snatched away in the Greek and taken to God to his throne. And why was the child taken away? To foil the plans of the dragon who want to devour the child as soon as he's born. This is a reference to the ascension of Christ after his resurrection. God took him to heaven to keep him from continually interfering with Christ's larger work. That's why he sent the Holy Spirit. Because it might be possible to fight one guy, but you can't fight in his incarnation, but you can't fight an omnipotent and omnipresent spirit who's all over the world all at the same time. So Jesus was taken to heaven to foil the plans of the dragon who stood in front of the woman to destroy it. Now, the image also moves forward in verse 6. The woman fled into the wilderness. The key Greek word is the word then. It means subsequent to that, and therefore the interpreters believe that verse 6 is a reference to Israel as a national entity at the end of days, which is why she's taken to the wilderness someplace. We do not know where. It's just a place that had been prepared to be taken care of for 42 months, 1,260 days to be exact. So to sum up, the woman clothed with the sun and the stars is not church, Mary. It's Jesus in his birth. Mary, I'll grant you, in her pregnancy with Jesus, that's true, but she's not. The woman is not the church. The church is not raptured at this verse. Now, it's taken off the earth at another time, but that has nothing to do with this verse. This has to do with the ultimate rise of Mystery Babylon the Great. We'll see that later. And the place of the dragon in implementing all of those latter-day plans that he has that will, of course, come to nothing.
Right. Well, again, as you rightly pointed out at the beginning of the program, we're recording this at a time in California for you. Here in New Zealand, we're already in the 23rd. It's a beautiful sunny day here in New Zealand as you are preparing for...
Great day for a rapture.
Yeah, well, and you know, and all joking aside, I mean, I think what's important for us here, William, is to appreciate the fact that certainly if there is a benefit of all of this interest, it certainly heightened the interest of people, perhaps misguided from our perspective, but it's heightened an interest in end times things. People are being earnest. People are becoming excited. From our perspective and from my perspective, I think the great danger here is that as people wake up and the promoters of this idea, revise their positions or whatever they're going to do. I don't know. I would hate to be in their position, but nonetheless, there'll be revisions. There'll be restating of understandings and whatever. I think we need to go back and say, should we be using, and the danger, should we even be using constellations and things like this? Is this not simply combining with Scripture that which is non-biblical? We're sort of yoking together something that's not part of the revelation of God, as if somehow we're going to have greater understanding of the Bible through linking it to these, at best, secular documents and speculations, and the danger that's there.
I think a good way to summarize what you're saying with that question is to remind everybody, there's a reason why Jesus informed his followers that no one would be able to know the day or hour of the Messiah's return. He wasn't merely referring to a general statement that no one could predict when he would return. I think he was referring specifically to any attempt to link his return to the liturgical calendar of Israel. The day is a reference, when he says day or the hour, is a reference to the liturgical calendar. And the hours, well, that would be the times of prayer, the set times of morning, evening, and afternoon that took place in the temple. Or in the case of Daniel, when he had to pray in his own residence because the temple was destroyed. So Jesus was warning his followers that even though the dates and times of Jesus' life in his mortal incarnation would be fulfilled, specifically, Sir Robert Anderson got it right down to the day, as I recall, of the 69 weeks of years. But rather, he would not be doing so with respect to his second coming. In other words, I may have died on Passover in fulfillment of the liturgical calendar in my first coming, but don't you think I'm going to do it with my second coming. That's what he means by you won't know the day or the hour. And to sum up, the one day of the year I can guarantee you Jesus is not coming is on the Feast of Trumpets.
Right. Okay. Well, that's certainly a prediction. It's a reverse prediction.
Let's find out if I'm right. We've got about 11 hours based on from this time, because it'll be midnight on the 23rd, which is about 23 hours from now.
Yeah. Well, and again, It's just again a reminder to all of us to get back to the Bible, stay with the Scriptures, and we really encourage people to do that. And William, again, thank you for allowing me to have this phone call and this opportunity to talk to you about this. I know you've got lots going on and getting ready for the upcoming October conference, Strategic Perspectives. We have a good line of speakers there, so we're anxious to be able to hear what you have to say there. But again, thank you very much for being on the program.
I'm happy to do it, and we'll see y'all on last week of October.
Thank you, William. God bless you.
A month after the rapture. Think of that.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope this program has been of some use. I hope you appreciate the fact that this is not an I told you so type of format. We're just simply trying to further investigate this interest in this passage and trust that this will be something that will again drive all of us back to the Scriptures only. So may God bless you as you continue to study His Word. God bless you.
At the Koinonia House Strategic Perspective Conference, which I expect to address next month. And it's particularly interesting that we would choose this hour and this time to do this study of a refutation of the eschatology heresy, because literally at 2 o'clock California time on the 23rd, which is what on the 22nd, it is midnight, literally, in Jerusalem, the beginning of the Feast of Trumpets, which means the end of the world will be sometime in the next 24 hours, if you believe the nonsense that's been floating around the internet. And of course, we deny that completely. I will tell you, Ron, I believe that there's a good high possibility that we're seeing the fulfillment of Matthew 24:11, if you want to talk about Bible prophecy, on the second coming, where Jesus talked about a falling away from the faith that will come about in the end times. And he says many, the Greek word poloi means this is not going to be a minor movement. A lot of people will be scandalized. That is the Greek word. They would fall away because of the scandal of disappointments. I believe it's because of people like this. They twist the Scriptures using an occultic amalgamation, and they sell a whole lot of books until, of course, the day after.
Yes.
Which will be, by the time this is aired, in the past.
Yes, yes. Well, let me just, when you were giving us sort of your quick overview of your experience, was the Revelation 12 verses 1 to 5 sign fulfilled on September 23rd, as so many have been hoping? We'll take that question into the Forge. Hi, everyone. I'm Ron Matsen. If you've been following The Forge, you know that we've had a couple of sessions here where we've looked at the questions associated with some of the interpretations of the Revelation chapter 12, verses 1 to 5 sign. And we've addressed them here. And what I want to do today is now, since this is the 23rd of September 2017, we want to take a look at those, and I'm going to invite someone onto the program, I think, that will give us some great insight. Now, just as a recap, perhaps you've not heard of this, or you're wondering what I'm going to be addressing. there's a conclusion that was come to by many that September 23rd, 2017 is the date of the fulfillment of the Revelation 12 prophecy concerning both the woman and the child. The expectation of that date was perhaps it was even heralding the rapture of the church. Now, the evidence that most of them pointed to was based on a convergence that involves the constellation Virgo. It happens, the 23rd, the 21st happens on or about the Feast of Trumpets. It's a time when the sun passes through Virgo, Virgo being a symbol of the nation of Israel. The moon passes by the feet of Virgo. Jupiter enters and remains in Virgo as the child that's depicted there in the vision in Revelation 12. And the 12 crowns, or the 12 stars are made up of the 9 stars of Leo, plus Mercury, Venus, and Mars provide the other 3 stars, the 12 stars. And so this is the evidence that they all point to, all converging on this day, the 23rd of September 2017. Now, the assumptions that are made here is what I really want to look at in this post-analysis, really. Number one is this is based on the Genesis 1:14 word signs, which they believe is equivalent to the Mazzaroth. It's presented by some as the gospel in the stars. Number two, Job 38, verses 31 and 32, where there is this use of the word Mazzaroth, and it's believed to be equated to the 12 constellations of what we now know as the zodiac. We then have the Matthew chapter 2 star that's referenced there, often referred to as the Bethlehem star, and that this was, at the time of the birth of Christ, was again another Virgo convergence of a sort. We'll take a look at that in terms of what the text tells us. And Revelation 12 itself, whether or not the child that's depicted there is the church. Now, what I'm going to do is we're going to look at that first, and the way we're going to do it is I've invited onto the program Dr. William Welty. And so William will be joining us from his residence in California. Welcome to the program, William.
Hello. Well, welcome to the end of the world.
Well, that's certainly how some depicted it, and many people may not know who you are. So give us a little bit of background in terms of who you are and your association and with Bible interpretation. So give us a little background, William.
With respect to my educational background, I hold a Master Divinity degree. Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield, Illinois. I studied New Testament Greek and Biblical Hebrew under some of the foremost evangelical scholars of their generation, Walter Kaiser and Gleason Archer. And when I left seminary, I taught Greek for 10 years in a Christian law school, and developed some technology issues that allowed me to sell the technology and start a foundation to produce a new Bible translation called the Standard Version. And I supervised the production of arguably what has been considered the most readable and accurate modern language translation of the Bible ever produced. And that gives me some training and background, and frankly some bona fides to speak reliably about the meaning of the text, both in Hebrew language when they're trying to study it, and particularly with respect to issues relating to the book of Revelation and this heresy, this new heresy that's been infecting the church for the last couple of years, that I think you and I have come to label as astro-eschatology. That is a unbiblical and frankly occultic amalgamation of Babylon mystery, cult issues relating to astrology, and the book of Revelation, particularly the apocalyptic literature. prophetic literature that discusses the end of days. So that's basically where I come from. People who are familiar with K House know that I have been served for many years as a board member and have been a regular teacher